Hello, Goldies. Is that the official WWGOA title for whom you are? We are for gold only right now. We're going to do a Mortise and Tenon gig here on the router table, and I'll talk about in a second. I'll talk about some things I like, some things I don't like about this arrangement. One of the things I want to address right away is there is a question already, which is thoughts on using a Panta router for Mortise and Tenon joints, pros and cons. If you're not familiar with the Panta router, it's a very cool tool, and its history, its story is also very cool. So maybe as a kid, you used a pantograph, which is a thing where if I have a stylus here and I'm tracing a picture of a chicken, I don't know why a chicken, there's a pen or a pencil over here, and it's drawing whatever I'm tracing. And by putting it in one position, it could be a 1-to-1 ratio. In other words, if this is a 4-inch tall chicken, I'm going to draw a 4-inch tall chicken. But you can also change that, make it bigger, make it smaller. So that's the panto part. Bunch of years ago, an individual created a pantograph router, a Panta router device, all made out of Baltic birch plywood. And the way it worked was, the way it works is you've got templates, and a stylus is tracing that template, and there's a router bit connected, and the router bit is going to cut whatever that is. The router is mounted horizontally. So you can imagine if I had a template with a slot in it, and I enter that slot and go back and forth, over here the router is going back and forth, and that's cutting a mortise. If I have a dovetail shaped template, it'll cut a dovetail. If I have just an external that I trace, it'll cut a tenon. So the cool thing about it, so what happened is that individual developed this. Another individual thought that was pretty cool and started to mass produce it. So the commercial version of Panta router today is a very precise device made out of extruded aluminum, and it's got a lot of really cool features. The dust collection on it is really, really good. So in the world of just joinery, this is a really great tool to add to your shop to enable you to do lots and lots and lots of different kinds of joinery. And the best thing to do is just on WWGOA.com, use the search window, search Panta router, and I have done 2 or 3 videos with this device, so that way you can see better than I can explain. As it pertains to Mortise and Tenon in particular, if we're saying Mortise and Tenon router table versus Mortise and Tenon Panta router, it's a little bit apples to oranges because there are some limitations of what we can pull off here, but this is a very easy setup to do. I would say setup is pretty simple in both cases. The Panta router is going to give you more options for doing other stuff with a Mortise and Tenon joint. So for instance, you can very easily put a template on there that allows you to do a double tenon joint. That would be more difficult to do here at the router table. You can do through Mortise and Tenon on the Panta router with a variety of different shapes. So not just a standard tenon shape, but like a dog bone shape and a bunch of different stuff. So there are a lot of options on the Panta router. If you're going to do a Mortise and Tenon for a project, then setting it up here on the router table is a great way to go. If you're going to do a lot of Mortise and Tenon joinery and dovetails and dados and other stuff, the Panta router is going to pay off because it's so versatile, because it's capable of doing so many different things. So let's talk, let's look at the anatomy of a Mortise and Tenon joint so that we're all using the same verbiage here. And then from there, we'll talk about the setup and where we're going. So Mortise and Tenon, of course, the negative part of the joint is the mortise. Positive part of the joint is the tenon. That tenon will, when properly executed, slip into the mortise like that. We've got a few rules of the road that are pretty common to mortise and tenon joinery that you should know about. As a general rule, a tenon, so this component, is 1/3 the size of whatever you're cutting the tenon into. So 3/4 inch stock, 1/3 of that is 1/4. That means the tenon sizing should be such that the tenon ends up 1/4 inch thick. We do that calculation based on the size of, this would be the rail in your table. So we do that based on the thickness of the rail, but we know the tenon, which means we're going to do the mortise first. The reason for that is that the mortise is going to be created by some cutting tool, in this case, a router bit. It could be a mortise machine. It could be a drill bit. The size of this is fixed. If I'm aiming for a 1/4 inch tenon, I use a 1/4 inch router bit. That leads to then making a tenon that fits the hole, the mortise, created by that cutter. So the reason the sequence is important is that, yes, I'm calling this a 1/4 inch router bit. Is it really 0.250? Maybe it's 0.48. So the mortise is going to end up a little undersized. If I start by making a 1/4 inch tenon, assuming it's going to fit in the hole when I'm done, you could be disappointed. So you always are going to make the negative first, make the mortise, because that's dictated by the size of the cutter. Then come back and make the tenon to fit. The other thing that is important on this is when you're cutting the tenon, see how we've got a shoulder above and a shoulder below and a shoulder and a shoulder. The reason for that is, I've often said woodworkers are lazy, and that's why a lot of these things are developed. The reason for the shoulders on the ends is so that when I put the piece, the rail, into that mortise, the shoulders are covering the mortise. If the length of the mortise and the length of the tenon were exactly the same, when I do this, you better have done a really, really good job making that joint, or you're going to have a mortise show here. So the job of the shoulders is to mask the end of the mortise. One of the things that's going to come from us doing this particular technique is the ends of that mortise are round. The ends of the tenon we're going to cut are square. We're going to make them round. So we're going to make this match this. Now let me jump on my iPad and see if any questions have popped up from you crazy kids. Okay, so far, so good. I'm going to cut the mortise with a 1/4 inch upcut spiral router bit. If all you have is a 1/4 inch straight, that's fine. With an upcut spiral, it acts like a drill bit. And the flutes on that cutter help evacuate stuff out of the mortise. So it's better, given the choice, use an upcut. But if all you have is a straight, you're still going to be okay. The tenon, we're going to cut with a 3/4 inch bit. Both of those bits are sourced for you in the description, so you can grab those there. Let's talk about limitations. Here's where this whole thing is going. Once we're set up, I'm going to take my leg, not my leg, but my leg, and I'm going to plunge that onto the bit, move forward, making a mortise, and come off the bit. So I'm comfortable, and I've had students do this in classes a bunch of times. I'm comfortable with the concept of doing this with a 1/4 inch cutter. I would not be so comfortable doing this with a 3/8 inch bit if we wanted a 3/8 inch tenon. Certainly not comfortable with the concept of plunging onto a 1/2-inch bit for a 1/2-inch tenon, just because with those larger cutters, there's so much more dynamic to that cut. And part of what one could do would be to reduce depth of cut and do it in steps. That would help. But at the end of the day, I'm going to say, for me, I find this process works great. The limitation being 1/4-inch tenons in 3/4-inch stock, which I think is okay because we so commonly work with, I've built a bazillion tables that have 3/4-inch thick rails. One of the things that I didn't talk about when we talked about the geometry of making the tenon is the length of the tenon is 2 times its thickness. So let's cycle back to that formula. 3/4-inch rail, tenon is 1/3 the thickness. So it's a 1/4-inch thick tenon times 2 means it's a 1/2 inch long. So again, going back to the dynamic of what we're asking ourselves in the router table to do is 1/4-inch upcut spiral bit set to a 1/2 inch. We'll talk more about that. We're going to plunge onto it, move, come off of it. So again, if I'm doing a 3/8 tenon, that means a 3/4-inch deep mortise. So that's a lot to do this way. So on those bigger, in that bigger work, we're back to Panta router or a plunge router equipped with a fence or a benchtop mortiser or drill a series of holes with a Forstner bit on a drill press. There are lots of other ways to make those bigger joints. But the router table setup we're going to do really lends itself to this 1/4-inch tenon. Step 1 is going to be setting our depth of cut on the router bit. So I'm going to be using, I've got a lift in my table, so I'm going to be using the router lift to control the height of the cutter. Like an elevator. Now I said, 3/8 inch deep mortise, 1/2 inch deep mortise. That isn't quite correct. Put the insert in. Bloop. Grab my 1/2 inch bar stock. What we want, router of course is unplugged. We want the depth of the mortise to slightly exceed the length of the tenon. If you try to make them perfectly match, you're just going to pull your hair out. And you may have noticed I don't have any hair left to pull out. So life is easiest if the length of the tenon is going to be the perfect 1/2 inch. The depth of the mortise is a little bit, about a 1/16 of an inch would be fine, a little bit more than the length of the tenon. Doing this with bar stock is so much easier than doing this with a ruler. I always do my setup with bar stock. Height of the bit is set. Now, what we need to know is when we get on here with our leg, we're going to use the fence, we're going to plunge, move, lift. So we need to know where that action is all going to happen. Here's how I'm going to make it happen. First thing I'm going to do is close the fence. For what we're doing here, we don't need an opening. And for what we're doing next, it's going to be easier if we don't have an opening. Now, next thing I'm going to do is position the fence. So let's look at our existing mortise and tenon. And there's a reveal right there. There's a step. And I'm going to do that same thing on what we're about to do. So depending on the size of that reveal, that is going to change where we locate the fence. In this case, I'm going to again use my 1/2 inch bar stock and use that to space how far from the cutter I should be. So far, so good. So we are, to revisit, slightly more than a 1/2 inch deep. We are a 1/2 inch away. That's going to give me a 1/4 inch reveal. Now, where do we start? Where do we stop? What I'm doing with my pinkies there, I'm turning that bit. So now there's a flute that way and a flute this way. Not quite, almost. There. So now that flute is this way, that flute is that way. I'm going to take a piece of scrap and put it against the fence and against the bit. What I'm finding here is, what I'm looking for is, where's the edge of that cutter? So again, this end has been squarely cut. I'm doing this, tracing this. Then I do this. Same thing on this side. Kiss against the cutter. Trace it. So if you look right there, those two lines define the diameter of the bit. Sequence of events is important. I want to have the fence in place this way before I do this, because if I move the fence back and forth now, maybe it also shifts this way a little bit, and we can't have that happen. These lines, to be useful to us, need to come up the fence. So I'm going to do this. I'm basically now just using my board as a square, tracing. And tracing, I realize I'm blocking you. So again, these two lines represent the diameter of that cutter. So let me come back here. And I don't want you to not be like drinking from a fire hose here. So let me see if there are questions we need to address this far. Okay, so Jonathan says, I see many people online squaring the mortise with a chisel. Why would you choose to round the tenon instead of squaring the mortise? Because I'm lazy, is the real answer. It's much easier to round an external than to square an internal. And at the end of the day, when it comes to the strength of a mortise and tenon joint, when it comes to the strength of using a festool domino, it's all about the relationship between the face of the tenon and the face of the mortise. So even if they're squaring the mortise, their expectation is not that a perfectly square edge on top of the tenon is perfectly mating to the square surface they just cut inside the mortise. Our glue surface, our strength, comes from this face and this face being glued inside the mortise. I don't care. I mean, I don't want to diminish it. I don't want to round these to where now the tenon is a 1/2 inch shorter. All we're doing is taking the corners off. But there can be a little wiggle room this way between the fit of the mortise and the tenon, and your strength is going to be fine. So at the end of the day, you'll see when we get this one cut, all I'm going to do is grab a utility knife and go, brut, 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 done. So it's really, really simple to do. Squaring that rounded mortise with a 1/4 inch mortise chisel, which is a chisel you should be using for that. And I would venture to guess not many people actually own a mortise chisel. They own bevel edge chisels, but you really should be doing that kind of work with a mortise chisel. So squaring that off is way more difficult to do than rounding this. Jennifer says, what do you recommend for larger mortise and tenon? So that's back to plunge router with a fence, something like the Panther router. You can do the tenon or the mortise on a drill press, pointing to mine, but you can't see it. Drill press by drilling a series of overlapping holes with a Forstner bit. We've got videos on that. So there are a bunch of different ways to do it besides plunging, and that'll be easier for you and me, rather than plunging into a 3/8 or 1/2 inch diameter bit on a router table. Okay. Now, prep. We've got the fence in the right spot. We've got our layout lines located on the fence. On your leg piece, you need to mark out your mortise. Now, it's important that these layout lines are on this face. I'm going to cut the mortise in this face. Typically, you're going to have a mortise in this face and a mortise in this face. So you're going to have layout lines also on 2 adjacent faces, like you would cut mortises on 2 adjacent faces. For what we're doing here, I've only got them on 1 face because I'm just going to do the 1 mortise for the sake of demo. But we need to have them on the top face because that's how we're going to take advantage of those lines we just made, those layout lines. So let's come back to looking one more time for questions. All right, we're clear there. So big picture, what's going to happen once we get on a tighter view again here is I'll show you how to take advantage of our lines. I'm going to plug my router back in. I'm going to put my hearing protection in. What? And then we'll make a mortise. So hearing protection for me. Now here's the way I'm still unplugged. Here's the way this is going to work. That line, I'm going to get you in a little tighter. That line is the outfeed side of the router bit. See if I can tilt you down without messing this whole thing up. There we go. All right, that's better. Now don't get confused here. There's the seam between the 2 pieces of MDF. I don't care about that. That pencil line is the outfeed side of the cutter. That pencil line is the infeed side of the cutter. What I'm going to do is position, I'm going to turn the router on. I'm going to position that line on the line that pertains to the outfeed side of the bit, plunge, move forward until the other layout line is in line with the infeed side, and then we're going to lift off. So a couple important things here. One is feed direction. By going right to left, sorry, the rotation of that bit is helping to hold me against the fence. That's important. Let me get a little water in me. If you go the wrong way, it's going to have a tendency to pull the wood away from the fence. It goes really bad, really fast. So we're going to get on that line, move right to left, and then lift off. Now, normally, we want to, sorry, one more water. It's like I've been doing woodworking all day. Generally, what we want is to end up with the top of the rail even with the end of the leg. So when they come together, they're going to look like this. This board, this walnut, was laid out just like this to start with. Then I went back and cut it to length. So where I'm going with this is this board is easier to work with if you leave it a little too long. It gives you some real estate on this end to hold on to for when you plunge, move, lift, rather than have it already cut to length. All right, plug it in. Get my earbuds in my ears. So the thing to watch for here is just the relationship between the layout lines on the board and the guidelines that define the router bit here on the fence. And we have that. Even with an upcut spiral, got to knock a little bit of dust out of there. All right, what's going to happen next is that cutter's going to come out and a different bit's going to go in because it's a 2-bit operation, like most of what I do. So let me look for if there are any questions about this setup before I lose it. Okay, unplug. So of course, if you're doing a table, you're going to do this 8 times. 4 legs, 2 mortises per leg. What we need next is a larger diameter cutter. I'm going to use a 3/4. We know we want to end up with a 1/2 inch long tenon. So I like for the diameter of my tenon cutting bit to be slightly more than the length of the tenon I'm trying to produce. And you know, like anything, not just in woodworking, but in the world, you want to practice this stuff before you actually need it for a project. And I use as an example all the time, like playing guitar. I play a little acoustic guitar, but just buying a guitar doesn't mean I can go to open mic and start playing. One has to practice these things first. So when you're in your shop, you really want to spend time just, grab some poplar is a great practice wood, and set these joints up, practice making them, keep the pieces that you practice with and write notes on them. And then you can go back and look at them. When you're ready to do the real thing in a project, you'll be more ready. Like, the first time that you do this shouldn't be when you're trying to make the heirloom table for your kid, because there's just too much opportunity to mess that up. So take the time to practice this stuff just like you would practice anything else. Now for what we're going to do with this bit, I need to open the fence back up. And it'll come forward. Let me look for questions before, otherwise I'm going to get you on a tighter camera again. All right, Eric asks, the router bit in the description has a 1/4 inch shank. Is there a difference compared to a 1/2 inch shank? Is a 1/2 inch shank better? So for some stuff, it depends. Like, for the bit I just put in there, the 3/4 inch straight is a 1/2 inch shank. The reason being, I'm probably demanding more of that cutter than I ever am of the 1/4 inch bit. 1/4 inch bits like the one that are sourced here, I use those in my CNC all the time. And that's, of course, the CNC head is traveling. It's cutting stuff to size. I'm punching holes. It's way more arduous. The CNC has a chance to be way more arduous on a cutter than what we're doing in the router table. Larger diameter bits, anything I'm going to ask more of, I tend to go with the 1/2-inch shank. Part of the byproduct then of that bigger shank is usually less chatter in the cut. For what we're doing here, the 1/4-inch shank is fine. Okay, so let's go back to this one. And look at a couple different things. First off, the height of the cutter. So remember our formula for making a Mortise and Tenon. 3/4-inch stock. The tenon, anyone? The tenon is 1/3 of that, so it's 1/4. So by math, that shoulder on the bottom should be, the cheek on the bottom should be 1/4. This should be 1/4. As a result, in the perfect cartoon bubble, when I set the height of this bit, if I set it to 1/4, we should be hunky-dory. Oops. But what I don't want to take the risk of is making the tenon too small. I haven't figured out how to put wood back on. I could always take more wood off. So I'm going to set this so it's a little bit below the bar stock, resulting in, that's going to be a tenon that's too big. It won't fit into the mortise. That's good, because then we can change the cutter and go again until we have this dialed in. So still using bar stock, but I'm setting below it, not even with it. Then for the fence, we can come back to our 1/2-inch bar stock again, bring the fence into play, and I'm going to close it a little for now. Now in this case, I do want this to be right. I want to produce a 1/2-inch long tenon. I'm going to put this on the fence and use it. I'm feeling for the carbide cutter right there. I want the face of the bar stock to be even with the carbide cutter. Lock that in place. And of course, that's incumbent on that router bit being turned so that that flute is at its maximum point away from the fence right now. It's at top dead center in this rotation. So theoretically at this point, we're G to G, we're good to go, which is gonna mean and up against the fence, leaving a tenon in the middle. But life is gonna be easier, you'll see why in a sec, if I close the fence. And when I do that, I'll switch cameras so you can see it better. I'm gonna run the bit and I'm gonna push the fence over the cutter so I can completely close this. So let's do, I'm plugging my router in. Then I'll get you in the right spot, get my earbuds in. So if I hadn't previously done tenons on this router table, it would have made that cut right there. The recess that is there in the table, right, in the fence right there, wouldn't already be there. Now to make the cut, we need to go across like this, but we have to back that up. Because a couple things, this piece is 3 inches, it's pretty narrow, so there's a chance for it to walk. When the cutter exits, it would probably split that out. So I've got a waste piece with which I can do this. Additionally, we have to be able to take this and stand it on edge and go over that bit. That's part of the reason that helps to close the fence, so that this piece can't fall into that opening. So then I'm going to take that piece of scrap and just do this. And then what we're up against is, does that tenon fit into that mortise? And it doesn't, which is good, because that was the agenda. It's quite a bit too big, so we have to raise the cutter. Now, the thing you have to remember here is, if this tenon is a 1/16 of an inch too big, you only raise the cutter a 32nd, because we're cutting twice. So let me get where I can see it better. I'm probably an 1/8 oversize. So just to make sure I don't bump into my fence, I'm opening my fence back up. Then I'm going to raise, if I go a full rotation on this router lift, that's a 1/16. I'm going to go a little less than that, because again, I can always take more off. Can't put it back on. So I'm going to try it about there. And then see, I just want to make sure I'm clear here on the fence. All good. And then we just do the same thing again. So it's critical that you have scrap that you made at the same time as you made your real rails, because this piece I'm doing the test cuts in has to be exactly the same thickness as your project pieces. All right, tiny bit still, tiny bit too big, that's okay. And this is where it gets, you just got to be real careful with your changes now, because we're very, very close. So I'm going to just sneak a little bit, lock. Don't get impatient. that's so close. Oh, that might be there. So let's talk about how do I know when I have a fit? What I'm after, and this is dados, mortise and tenon, dovetails. I should be able to take a component, slide it, well, that's pretty good. Slide it with hand pressure into the other component, but when I do this, friction holds them together. If I lift and the leg stays on the router table, you've overcut the tenon, it's too small, you got to start over. If you're having to use a mallet to pound this in, the tenon is still too big. And the risk there is you could split the leg when you're trying to drive them together. We still have to round the corners on that, but let me look for questions. Voiced. All right. All right, Joseph says, with the main advantage of using a router table versus a handheld router, the steadiness of the cut. Are different routers and router tables interchangeable, such as a Bosch router with a Ryobi table? So I would say for what we're doing here, this is much easier to execute than a plunge router with a fence. Making the mortise is much easier to do here on the router table. With the tenon, what we're doing here to produce the tenon with the 3/4 inch straight bit could also be done on a table saw with a dado head. It could be done by hand if you want to go that route. So there are a lot of different ways to execute the tenon. So yeah, part of doing it here is it's a lot easier to manage. Interchangeability of parts, your mileage may vary. As a rule, like this is a Harvey router table that has a hole in it that's a very common size for router plates and router lifts. So Harvey doesn't care what I put in this table, but Harvey doesn't make a router. So I don't know for Ryobi, because I think they make a router, or do they have some proprietary thing going on with a Ryobi table that would prevent a Bosch router from hanging in there? You'd have to check with Ryobi to make sure. Look in your owner's manual, and there should be something in there that talks about how you fasten the router in. In my experience with router tables, for the most part, trying to think if I've ever had something that's idiosyncratic. I don't think so. For the most part, it's been, option A, to put a DeWalt router in here, do this. And there's like holes that you have to use. Option B is a Bosch. Option C is a Porter cable. Option D is a Ryobi. Option E is a Triton, whatever. So in most cases, it's stuff is interchangeable, but maybe not always. Okay. So next, square peg round hole, right? We've got the tenon I just cut has square corners. The mortise I produced previously has rounded corners. That ain't gonna work. So this is where I think let's try this camera for this. See where we are in the world. Where in the world is Carmen Sandiego? All we need to do is take a little bit off of there. If I were doing an entire table, and if I were willing now to move the camera a bunch, I would put this rail in a vise, and I would do this with a bench chisel. I don't want to stand here with a bench chisel with my hand as the vise, paring those corners off and take a chance I slip and I end the live early to go to the ER. So I'm doing it with a utility knife. But basically, that's the operation right there. We just got to take a little off of that corner. A little off the top, please. And again, if it's slightly overcut, I'm not asking the length of that tenon to perfectly match the length of that mortise. In fact, I don't want it to, and I'll show you why in a second. So back to this, pare a little off, pare a little off. See if they go. Just, whoop, sorry, got you out of camera. Just like that. Now, the reason I'm saying if we ended up with a two, I'm thinking I'm doing math in my head. If we had a 2.5 inch long mortise, and I'll talk about that. If we had a 2.5 inch long mortise, I don't mind the tenon being 2 3/8 because I want to have some wiggle room so that when I put these together, I can adjust the rail up and down until it's perfectly flush with the end of the leg. Same thing, if I'm doing a mortise here for a lower rail on a piece, a stretcher, I still want to be able to move that up and down and set it to a layout line. So for me, the tenons are always a little bit shorter, narrower than the length of the mortise. Now let's talk about that mortise length. Think about how we cut the tenon. Pass, 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 pass. 3/4 inch stock, 1/4 inch tenon. That shoulder was a quarter. That shoulder was a quarter. That means that shoulder is also a quarter, as is this one. So if this is a 3-inch rail, we're shooting for a 2.5 inch mortise because that's a quarter and that's a quarter. The final tenon is 2 7/16 or whatever it is because of the way the ends were paired to make them round. So in 3/4 inch stock, where I'm producing a 1/4 inch tenon, the length of the mortise will always be a 1/2 inch less than the width of the rail. A lot of stuff. Mortise and tenon's a relatively simple joint, but there's a lot of little stuff to make it go. Oops. All right, making sure I'm not missing any questions. So I'm caught up there. So let me do, I'm just going to talk for a second to just see if any other questions come sailing in. Okay. So if you've not heard me talk about it already, I'm very excited about our April Q&A live. So normally that Thursday live, and you can doze for a second here if you've heard me say this about 6 times in the last 2 weeks. Normally our live Q&As are on the second Thursday of the month, 4 in the afternoon. In April, we're pushing it back. It's going to be April 25th, still a Thursday, still 4 o'clock in the afternoon, but a different Thursday of the month. The reason being, Rob Johnstone is going to be here with me. You probably already know who he is. He was the managing editor for Woodworkers Journal magazine for many, 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 many years. Like a couple of decades, I think. I'm sure I first met Rob 25 years ago. So he's going to be here doing some video with me that week, and then he's offered to stay for the live Q&A. So the really cool thing about this is, 1, it's another woodworker who knows all sorts of stuff I don't know. 2, Rob was formally trained as a luthier, as an instrument maker. So he's got a really cool background in that. Maybe he'll bring a guitar and we'll play some guitar together. I don't know. He's a big hand tool guy, which is not my strong point. So it's an opportunity to bring your hand tool related questions for Rob, not for me. So mark on your calendar and just kind of keep an eye out for that because it's a different date. It's a different date than normal. Different day of the month. Jesus says, it's the sequence of cutting horizontal sides, then vertical to avoid bad cutout, chip out, or does it matter? I don't know that it really matters. I mean, either way, you got to back it up with scrap. So as long as you're backed up with scrap, you're minimizing the tear out. So sequence shouldn't matter. So Joseph says, what will steady the tenon not quite snug as you described? Oh, like to make, if you overcut it and it doesn't fit, like it's too loose. So you could do a couple things. If you're determined to use that piece, for the joint to have the integrity it should have, you got to have a good fit. Woodworking yellow glue, woodworker's glue, will only compensate for like 3/1000ths of an inch or something like that. It's a pretty small number. It's not gap filling. So one, you could redo your rails. Two, what you could do is glue a piece of scrap on here and then recut the tenon. That's, if you don't want to remake that whole piece, glue a little 1/8 inch piece on both faces, then go back to the router table or the dado head and recut the tenon so you have a good fit. And one of the things I want to say is you want to be careful to not get like tricked when you're setting the height of the cutter, router bit or dado head, it doesn't matter. When you're setting the height of the cutter to do this, and you're sneaking up on that last little bit of fit. So you're in scrap and maybe, you do a pass, it's too big. Do a pass, it's too big. You want to make sure you're always doing 2 passes. So the get tricked part is you do a pass, it's a little bit too big. You raise the cutter, you make 1 pass, and it's a perfect fit in your scrap. Well, now the problem is going to be when you go to your real pieces and you make a cut, flip, make a cut, you're going to take too much off. So you want to do your test cuts in the same scenario as the real cuts, which is you're always going to be cutting from this face, cutting the edges, and cutting from this face. So make sure you don't fall into that little sand trap. Okay. Well, it looks like we're caught up on questions. So thanks so much for tuning in. Watch for another one of these gold-only live streams sometime next quarter. Max and I actually don't have it on the calendar yet, nor do I have a topic for it. But I'll tell you what, while we're all on here, there's 60 of you watching right now, and a bunch of you will be watching in the future. In that chat roll, write down what you would like to see for live stream topics. And as we move forward in the year, I'll look at that. And, if somebody wants, I think a good topic would be George in Hawaii. I would love that topic. So if enough of you say that, maybe the company that owns all this will send me to Hawaii. I don't know. Anyway, put in that chat roll what you'd like to see for future topics. I will take that into consideration. Oh, Max says on my budget. No. We got to give the public what they want, Max. If the public wants, and I think honestly, myself and my fiance in Hawaii is really what you want. I think that's the deal. So maybe, I don't know. Anyway, I'm getting more foolish than usual. All right, that's it. Thanks for watching. Watch your emails for the next time we do this, and I'll see you. Take us out, Max.